Hi, everybody. My name is AJ, and welcome to today's episode of The Future of, where we're going to be exploring AI in acquisition, specifically not the acquisition of AI. I'm really excited today to be joined by my co-hosts, Wilson Miles and Chris Barlow. Wilson is an associate research fellow at the Emerging Technology Institute, a partnering organization with the NDIA, National Defense Industrial Association. Wilson's research portfolio includes analyzing emerging technology supply chains, acquisition policy, workforce issues, and other modernization technology policy challenges. Chris is a senior acquisition analyst with MITRE. He specializes in business intelligence and process design and has spent the last 8 years as part of both MITRE and MITRE's Acquisition Innovation Center, or CAMS. So welcome to the both of you. I'll let you briefly add to your introductions.
Hey, AJ, thanks for inviting me. Nothing really to add. I think you covered it all pretty well. We pretty much focused on the intersection of emerging technologies and national defense. So thanks a bunch.
Hey, AJ, thanks for having me on as well. Happy to be here on the panel with Wilson. We're looking forward to the conversation. Not much to add for myself either. I think you covered my background pretty well.
Great. So as I mentioned, today we are here to talk about AI in acquisition. So let's just start by getting an overview of the topic, right? Acquisition is really broad. AI is really broad. So let's focus down. Who are we talking about? What are we talking about? Let's get some context from you guys.
Yeah, so I think I can kick it off. So I think there's a couple of points to this. So, in our world, we hear a lot that, contracting officers, for example, are, incredibly overworked. They're understaffed. People often complain about how long the acquisition process takes, particularly for the Department of Defense. And so we came at this paper that we did and an event that we co-hosted together back in the fall, trying to look at these issues, these possibilities. What are the opportunities for kind of supporting that acquisition workforce, speeding up the acquisition process, and particularly using AI tools to do that. And so I guess, from our perspective, why does this matter really for the warfighter? Because what we're going to be talking about today, I think, is quite a back office type function. And so you always have to bring it to reality a little bit and why this matters for the warfighter. And so this is really about delivering capabilities faster. And one of the ways that we're thinking about that problem is through speeding up that process using AI tools. And so it's whether helping the Department of Defense to do a better job at conducting market research or writing contracts, really just so that you can find bits and pieces in that process to help deliver that capability in a shorter time frame.
The speed of acquisition is definitely a need right now. If you look at our adversaries and you look at some of the additional or other organizations internationally and the way that they operate, the policy that guides them, they're able to acquire specifically warfighting capabilities at a much quicker pace than we are. However, aside from speed to delivery, we're also looking at enhancing outcomes. So leveraging AI from a background of being able to collect all of your organization's data, see what you've done in the past, analyze your previous outcomes. You should, in theory, be able to apply AI to enhance your outcome. It may not always be faster. It depends on the type of acquisition, but speed is definitely one of the things that we're primarily focused on. Enhancing the outcome, the overall effectiveness of the solution is another thing that is top of mind when we're looking at enhancing the acquisition process through leveraging AI.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about the speed and the challenges that you're seeing. I always like to get some specificity around that, right? You hear a lot as, especially myself as I'm coming into more of the industry side and getting my feet wet with working with different government agencies. You hear a lot of frustration with the acquisition process. And you mentioned speed and a couple other things. So, in the research that you've done, what are you seeing in terms of lead times and speed as some of the other challenges that are, really causing this friction?
So that's actually a very relevant lead in. I actually worked with an organization recently, and when we mapped out their lead times, we were looking at close to 2 years for a major system acquisition. Now that was not a DoD organization. I don't want to name the organization, but when mapping out those processes, we are seeing extended lead times when you talk to the program managers and they actually see what those lead times look like, because not all of them are tracking all of the steps in the process or looking at what the anticipated lead time needs to be. Some of them were very shocked, and we were maybe 18 months out from when they needed to award a follow-on or decide if they were going to recompete. So the decision-making time that the programs have in order to determine the way forward is significantly shortened based on these extended lead times. If you had tools and capabilities built into your processes that could enhance the speed, you would have less lead ahead time where you need to be aware of what's coming down the pipeline. I mean, typically when we're talking about people being understaffed, you don't have the time in the day to look 2 years in the future. You need to focus on what are the needs right now. And if we're operating in that environment, it limits the human's ability, the people of responsibility's ability to look and see what are their upcoming tasks that they need to make sure they have the resources to handle. And I think we see this across many federal agencies, not just the DoD, but the staffing, the process flow. There's a lot of inefficiencies within the system currently that we're trying to help solve by leveraging AI tools. And we'll get a little bit more into some of the use cases and how we're leveraging AI tools. But those are the initial problems that I've been seeing. And I will say that I don't see everything, so I'm sure some other people have different perspectives and can highlight some other things. But traditionally, from the organizations I've been ingrained with, those are the primary issues that we're trying to overcome.
I think Chris covered that very well. I think one thing that he said that I thought was very interesting is that sometimes these organizations aren't actually tracking how long it takes them to do things. And, I think we might touch on that piece a little bit later. But I think when we think about the insertion of AI into different parts of the acquisition lifecycle, and it can be big applications like market research, or it can be something as small as a chat GPT kind of function. Understanding where you're coming from and how long it takes you to do things so that you can actually advocate on the insertion of that tool is incredibly important. And so I think, again, we'll get into this a little bit later, but that's a really big piece that I think we should come back to.
I saw that, and that was a point I found really interesting. So after all the work that I've done in the private sector, seeing some of these challenges across some different federal agencies that you surveyed, they're almost the same challenges between the two, right? You have these complex workflows that a lot of times a specific organization might not even have an end-to-end view of that workflow and how long it takes and where the friction points are within that. So I thought that that was just really interesting to see, okay, there's overlap in these problems, so there's likely overlap in the solutions. And another point that I thought of as I was, both listening to you and our previous conversations is not just the risk in the duration it takes to finish the acquisition process for the agency itself, but also the different vendors, the companies that are trying to sell to the government. Then that puts a really long timeline between when they have pursued a contract and when they win it or complete that. So now you have some risk that does that vendor and contractor have the runway to sustain themselves between their response and delivery?
I actually thought the data piece is a very important topic. When you look at the amount of data and the data silos that the government has to account for, that is an overbearing burden that they need to take on and figure out how to manage and how to integrate so that they can optimize their AI solutions. Without digging into that too much, I think to the analogy of industry and government and the acquisition process, and when you're looking at the timeline specifically and how there are similar problems across the spaces, I think one of the risks that the government faces is due to the lengthy acquisition process. If you use AI, for example, how many times in the past 6 months has ChatGPT, for instance, rolled out a new update? right? So if you are a government agency and you are prescribing exactly what it is that you want to implement, and it's taking you 2 years to get that implemented, by the time you have that system, the risk is that pieces of that system or the system holistically could be outdated. So one of the benefits of speeding up that process and using things like AI to help enhance those outcomes is you should have more insight into where the technology could be by the time you're ready to implement, but also by limiting that timeline for implementation, you're now getting a system that is ready to use right now and should sustain you for the interim future as technologies are continuing to develop and iterate. I mean, you think about cybersecurity. That is a huge area of risk for every DoD organization. They're always worried about cybersecurity with any system implementation. And as policies change, as regulations change around cybersecurity, around how you mitigate threats, all of these different technologies need to be accounted for. So if you prescribe a certain set of regulations or requirements for your system that it needs to mitigate, but yet you've got all of these different threats coming in and developing concurrently as that system is being developed, you might get a system with outdated requirements. And so you really have to be cognizant of those parts and pieces and be able to flex and update those things, or at least know what's in the works. And so I think the intelligence piece of being aware of what not only your adversaries are doing, but what's possible from a system integration piece so that you're accounting for all of those things, that needs to be primary in your thought process as you go through implementation.
And I think that's a good lead in to really talk about those overarching challenges and differentiators that government agencies face. And people will be able to read this in the paper, but I like how you separated it broadly into three buckets. So there is the cultural issues or challenges, the policy challenges, and then the technical challenges. And you mentioned some of the vast amounts of data. And then you dove into some of the specific examples of each one of them. So why don't we take a moment just to talk about the culture, policy, and technical barriers that need to be overcome to help to improve efficiency?
So for the paper, I'll say, we use a lot of the content that came out of the event in the fall to inform it. However, Chris and I also did a bunch of interviews after the event on this topic, and I would just harp on that, at least in the DoD context. I know Chris can speak a little bit more broadly than that, but from our end, in the DoD context, there's a strong warfighter culture. And what that means and how that translates to applies to this conversation is that it's a bit of a challenge to get people to spend money on overhead. There's a finite number of dollars, and nobody quite likes this trade-off of back office type functions versus, hey, I can spend this money on a weapons platform, to simplify it basically. And so what that means is you really, really have to show an ROI for this. And so one of the problems with that is that there's that resistance initially. And then also in terms of justifying inserting these tools or buying these tools or developing these tools, you have to understand what you're improving. And one of the issues that we heard from a bunch of people in industry and in the services is that there's not a strong understanding of what people are spending their time on. It's kind of a black hole. And so some people might have data, some people won't. And it can also be quite siloed between the Navy, the Army, the Air Force, and OSD. And so there might be papers and literature with some kind of anecdotal assertions of what consumes people's time. And this has been a historical challenge of trying to have very concrete quantitative data on those responsibilities of what people are spending their time at. And those tools are, and that data is frankly needed because you have to understand how that AI tool is going to be improving that contracting officer's life. And so that was something that we heard a lot about. I would also just say that in the event, there was someone on a panel who said something really interesting, which is contracting officers don't have the time to learn a new tool. It has to be extremely simple so that they don't have to take a class on it. And what I took away from that is that some companies are building tools that are a little bit more complex than they should be. Again, harping on contracting officers, make it as simple as you can, because if it's not, they're not going to use the tool.
I think what we're seeing on the MITRE side is a lot of contracting officers will go from one organization to another organization within the government. And what that indicates to us is that there is inherently a shortage of contracting officers available for the government space. Ideally, you could do a workload assessment across all of the organizations, see what is the workload, what are the hours contracting officers are putting in. But if they don't have time to be trained on a new system, that's an inherent risk for them to be able to pick up and run with some of these emerging capabilities. So you'll see that user interface and usability is going to be a key piece. There's a term for it. I can't remember the term for it, but essentially it's like there's an organization within an agency that specifically works on system user interface to make things more intuitive. It's an important piece of the process so that the users can see familiar things, familiar themes across the systems, right? And that helps them with their comprehension on how to work within a system, right? Like if you open an Apple laptop, it's so familiar to an iPhone, if you have one, that it's sort of intuitive for you to navigate around and figure out how to function within it. However, if you have a Windows laptop going from an iPhone, right, it's two separate worlds. The amount of customization and usability on the laptop is going to be very different than what you get on your phone. So you're going to see a lot of those same issues within the government space with people seeing these variations across systems, and they're not quite able to wrap their head around the differences without intensive training, or at least deep diving how the system operates. I'm not sure if we cover this in the paper, Wilson, so back me up if we do. When you talk about culture and you talk about skills, a lot of contracting officers or a lot of people in the acquisition space are not inherently technical. Now, there are a lot of people that are technically savvy and understand technology, but you're going to see a big barrier to adoption from the workforce if they don't start to integrate small usages of AI or micro usages of AI within their daily workloads. That could include chatbots, right? That could include just familiarizing yourself with how these things work, understanding the outputs, understanding where the human in the loop or the human agency and the responsibility comes into verifying the information. And so if these people don't have early exposure to these tools, it's going to be a much more difficult process for them to adopt and start using these processes as they're being mandated to use them. So we will see a skill and a training issue potentially as organizations force the adoption of some of these tools and processes. But this is something that we can try to get ahead by having that foresight and, okay, we need to mandate this training for this organization, get people familiar with how to use some of these tools, even if it's just a free instance of ChatGPT.
You mentioned that a little bit in the people pillar of how do you incentivize people to take those trainings and proactively learn new systems. And you mentioned human in the loop, which I love, and we're going to get to that a little bit later. Pretty much in all of my conversations around AI, we've come back to human in the loop and where AI can really augment existing knowledge and subject matter expertise. So we'll get to that in a little bit. And then, Wilson, you were going to say?
I wanted to back Chris up and say, that some of those talking points are definitely in the paper. I wanted to add some to that, which is, the contracting workforce. There's data in the paper, for example, of the breakdown of age composition, and so, there are young folks in the contracting workforce. There are older folks in the contracting workforce. Everyone's going to have a different relationship to AI. And so people that are just coming in, they're in their mid-20s or early 20s, they're just out of college or other training programs, they're likely going to have been exposed to these tools. And so they're going to have a better relationship to it. And so, I know that DAU, Defense Acquisition University, puts on trainings, teaches people how to think about, large language models, etc. But it's going to require a little bit more than that, which is people are going to need different things depending on their exposure to it. And so one thing that we heard a lot of during our conversations with folks was that there needs to be more data and digital literacy plans, more tools, more trainings. I haven't heard that this is a complaint, but just that more work needs to be done and take into consideration that next level detail of, okay, these people might know a little bit more, so how do you train those folks? These people might know nothing, how do you train those folks? How do you expose them? How do you get those people to start using the tools? Because you might have an easier time or you might not, depending on their relationship to those tools.
And I want to touch on that as well as we get to the human in the loop part. So we'll get back to that. We talked about now the people aspect. There's definitely going to be a need for change management and a deep understanding of people's individual jobs and needs so that the solution can fit into exactly what will be the most effective for them. We talked a little bit about the data. How about policy, regulation, the bureaucratic side that really is federal agency specific challenges?
Okay, what I'll say is at the event and through our conversations with folks, my bottom line is that it seems like policy isn't a problem. There's nothing, for example, in the FAR, and we heard this at the event, that says that the department cannot use these tools for acquisition. But legislation is changing, EOs are coming out, and so I think from an industry perspective, there are a lot of things to consider, a lot of pieces of information to consider that could be confusing. And I don't know if we want to get into any of the executive orders, but there's a lot of opportunity there. But Chris, I might pivot to you and see if you have anything to share on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So to back Wilson up, I agree with everything he said. I would also say that we didn't hear that policy was enhancing the use or implementation of AI in acquisition. So it's not a barrier, but it's also not enhancing the process. I think it's sort of agnostic on it based on what we're seeing right now. There was an executive order that came out very recently. I think it was titled something like Returning Common Sense to Federal Acquisition Regulations. There's a lot of TBD on what that looks like. There's a lot of thought out there, but then there's also a lot of organizations that wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole because they want to see what everybody else is recommending first. I think it's going to be a very potentially combative space.
You guys both used the term FAR. So if you could just quickly explain FAR for the audience who might not know what that is.
So the FAR is backed up by statutes, and statutes could be U.S. code or applicable laws that govern the regulations within the FAR. It is essentially the legally binding document that all contracting officers and organizations have to abide by when they're going through the acquisition process. Some organizations, for example, the DoD has the DFARS, which is a subset of the FAR. Typically, what my understanding is, and this may vary by agency, is typically the agency guidance is the FAR with some slight modifications. And in that agency level documentation, if you were in that agency, that's what you would abide by first. And then any references not in that document, then you would go to the FAR for. And it would tell you, based on the clauses that you're looking at, whether or not the FAR supersedes or your agency documentation supersedes the FAR. And there's a bunch of legal review that goes into that and approvals that go into that process so that agencies understand what are the requirements that they have to abide by.
Understand. And I think as we talk about the future solutions and as this process is transforming, let's come back to that and think about how AI can help to facilitate the process of even understanding and navigating these regulations. You also mentioned that in your paper, just because of the complexity, the overlap in policies and regulations, having people who are able to understand, articulate, and quickly reference what is possible, what is not possible, also adds significant delays to this process.
Yeah, I mean, that's the common complaint, right? Which is that the FAR has become a bureaucratic mess. And I would just say that, there is a reason why the FAR exists, which is, again, to help protect the government in acquiring capabilities, but then also being a good spender of taxpayer money. But you are right, which is that a great use case for AI and acquisition is helping people understand and how to match FAR clauses to contracts. It's incredibly complicated. It's a huge barrier that we hear a lot at NDIA for in particular small businesses or non-traditionals. There are companies in the defense space who have entire legal teams dedicated to understanding this. And so, when you think about wanting to bring in, newer companies, especially software companies, having a tool out there that can help simplify that language would be amazing. I'm not sure if it exists, but that's a huge use case that people want to see.
Great. And you mentioned that agencies are apprehensive in really moving towards the bleeding edge of innovation because they want to see what other departments are doing. So you have a little bit of a chicken and an egg issue. So with that in mind, what have you seen in terms of agencies being successful today in adopting some of these new technologies? Do you have any examples of, hey, this group has been able to accomplish these benefits?
I know within the DoD right now, they're using things like the adaptive acquisition framework to help with system procurement. And I know through my experiences that other agencies and organizations are actively looking where they can implement AI into their acquisition process. I think we're still very early on in those activities. A lot of the things you're seeing are, let's focus on the manually intensive processes. Let's look at the things that you're going to repeat and it's manually heavy in every acquisition. Things that are not necessarily high scrutiny. Like we're not doing it for a down select. We're not doing it for source selection. We're doing it specifically for the things that are like internal process driven. Like, okay, can I summarize all of these market research documents to help me pull out the information that I need for my market research report? Things like that can save you time on the front end of the acquisition to help inform you and shape out what your solution needs to look like. Help you form your program documents that you'll eventually pass over to the contracting officer. There have been some initial successes. I think a lot of organizations are currently in pilot mode. I don't think they've done a lot of deep implementation. There's not a lot of what you would say are sustaining processes within the acquisition lifecycle right now. But I think they're open to these ideas and they're really exploring where they can get the most bang for their buck at low cost, improve efficiency, and drive outcomes.
I think if you're asking for successes, I think a lot of the successes are quite informal. And so, for example, I was reading on LinkedIn that someone posted about Nipper GPT, which is an AFRL tool. And, they were just saying that it helped them put together a list of questions to present to vendors who are making proposals on a cyber topic. And so it's just like a really small win. Earlier, we were talking about showing that ROI. And I haven't seen something or a document say, this tool helped condense our timeline by 10x. I've heard anecdotally that information is out there, but nothing in a formal document. You in addition to AFRL's tool, you see the Army coming out with a few pilots. But again, Chris's point, right? These are all pilot programs. An additional topic that should be said is that these are all great signs of progress. One thing that the department in particular struggles with, which is information sharing between pilot programs, sharing best practices, and then basically like learning and acting on those lessons learned. And so I think that the pilots are going to continue, and I would just encourage the department and the appropriate individuals to find ways to share those lessons learned between the services with OSD. And then, a big part of this is when you have those successes, scale them and Congress needs to fund those successes.
So that brings me to two questions. The first question, so You've mentioned ROI a couple times. I'd love to know more about what ROI looks like for the federal agencies versus private industry, which is, return on capital, right? So when you're talking about ROI, what are some examples of a positive ROI in this process?
In my opinion, ROI in the acquisition process is enhancing the process itself. We discussed already, it's a manually intensive process. It's very slow. It can be very arduous. So ROI in this is being able to increase the human resources ability to take on more. And by providing them with tools and giving them success in speeding up some of the manually intensive processes, they now have additional time at the back end of their day where they can focus on doing something else. One of the benefits of implementing some of these AI tools, especially augmenting the manually intensive work, is that the human can focus on the strategic and the overarching goals of the program that they're working on, right? If you have more time to think about the strategic view and how we need to approach a problem set, you're likely going to have a better outcome than if I'm sitting here collecting 30 different companies' names, dates, addresses for a market research report. So you really want to have the human focus on the things that only humans can do currently. Doesn't mean AI won't get there at some point. I'd like to stay away from that because I think the humans really are the ones with responsibility in this area. So you want them directing the acquisition, the outcomes of that acquisition. What does the system need to satisfy? You don't want to just go to ChatGPT and say, okay, I need a system to do A, B, and C. Oh, ChatGPT said it needs to be this, so that's what I'm going to go buy. That's not how we operate with AI, right? And so the human focusing on those outcomes gets you to the point where now all of your programs should have a better understanding of what the true problem set is. So typically, the problems are identified up at the top level and it has to flow down. And then the program's like, okay, this is the problem or the mission of our organization. How do we solve those problems? Staying in that strategic mindset should align you closer with that objective of the entire organization, where sometimes if you don't have the time to do that stuff, you're just going for what can I get based on the time that I have. I think that's a big risk.
This is a good opportunity to dive into human in the loop because we've circled this topic a couple times and it is really important. And I see this as a fusion of benefits, challenges, and threats, concerns to the individual, right? I'm hearing, and we see this all the time, benefits. The benefits is that you're unlocking individuals to do high value work. And one of the things that I keep hearing in my conversations is AI is poised to benefit the people with the most experience first, right? Because they know what great looks like, they know the job that needs to be done, and they're able to articulate their needs, take the output, and then sanitize it. So this is one, that's the benefit. The challenges is incentivizing people to use it, having a system that can understand the complexities and actually provide something that makes sense for that use case. And then the threat, I'll call it, is this do more with less mentality. If I'm somebody who now my job is in part done by AI, what's going to happen to my job, right? On one hand, I'm expected to deliver more outcome. On the other hand, well, am I even going to have the incoming work that I'll have to deliver on? So, yeah, let's talk about that for a bit.
I'd like to address the threat first. So I don't have a crystal ball. So what I'm saying here is strictly my opinion. While it is entirely possible that some people's jobs may be at risk because of increased efficiency with AI, that's not the trend that we're seeing. What we are seeing is that you actually need more people because the workload is already overbearing. When we had the contracting officer discussion earlier, it seems as if there's not enough contracting officers to manage the workload across the entire federal workforce. We need more people. If we can't get more people, we need better processes and systems to enable those people to meet the mission needs. So it appears that you're going to have a number of people that have the opportunity, especially the younger generation, to step into a space where they're familiar with a capability and be able to leverage that capability across the life cycle for their profession. With the older generation, they are currently the subject matter experts. They have all the knowledge. And while they may be a little bit AI adverse currently or averse, they are going to need to comply with the processes that their organization puts in place. So you sort of need that mix of generation, in my opinion, where you're having the young people collaborate with the older generation. There's knowledge transfer, there's tech knowledge, understanding transfer. So you're building your workforce. But one thing that I think is a major threat when it comes to your workforce landscape is succession planning. Some organizations, this was not something that was brought up federally, but I've heard industry discuss it. Well, if we can supplement all of the junior level work because we have the experts to refine all of that, then we don't need junior level engineers. That's simply not true. You have a huge risk of succession planning if you're not bringing in junior people and getting them up to speed and training them and creating the opportunity for them to become those subject matter experts. Because when the subject matter experts of today retire, the AI is not going to be able to replace them. So while the AI can act as a junior engineer, it can act as a mentor in some of these spaces. The workforce, especially within the acquisition workforce, benefits most when you have a blend of people from various backgrounds, various ages, various generations, and various knowledge bases. So, I think that's a really critical thing that we need to discuss. And I think that's something that everybody needs to keep an eye on, because there will be a problem with a skill gap with the older generation, and there will be a problem with the knowledge gap with the younger generation. And we need to find a way to bridge that gap. And AI may not be the full answer.
Yeah, and I guess I just want to address a little bit the human in the loop element. Everything I agree with that Chris said. I would just say the bottom line is, again, in the DoD context, the level of review doesn't go away in acquisition just because there's AI. And so there's never not going to be a human in the loop. At the end of the day, if you want to try to automate something like a test and evaluation master plan, at the end of the day, that SAE, the senior acquisition executive, still has to sign off on it. So the information is going to be there, whether or not it's human created, AI created, or a blend. And so I agree with Chris. I'm not on board with that AI is going to be taking people's jobs. I think that it's more about teaching them how to interact with them and ensuring that there are the appropriate review processes, because I think it's still going to change because just the processes by nature are going to change. But the level of review is always going to be there. So I'm not worried about bad information getting through, because the human review is always going to be integrated.
Yeah, and to piggyback on that, Wilson, quickly, if a contract officer leverages AI to build a contract, the contract becomes awarded. And upon award, we realized that there were some data or IP clauses that were not included in that contract. And now the vendor owns government data. There's a huge risk to security within that system. Who's the one that's going to get in trouble? It's not going to be the AI, right? At some point, the decision-making stops with the human. And so the humans have to be the last line of defense on anything. They have to review the contracts. They have to review the market research reports, right? Because at the end of the day, they are the ones responsible for those outputs when they're submitted. So AI is not going to be able to take on that risk. An organization wouldn't be able to say in a court of law, "Oh, we had the AI do it, so there's no fault on us," right? And so it's understanding where the legalities and the result of these actions really fall at the end of the day. Who is the human with the agency? Who is the decision maker? Who has responsibility? And that's how we sort of look at it from a MITRE perspective.
Yeah, and actually, earlier we were talking about the workflows in the commercial world and defense world being kind of similar. This is where DoD is a little bit different. DoD operates on a set of inherently governmental functions. So there are things that by law cannot be, delegated to a tool. That's providing money, for example. And so, I'm quite confident that those restrictions are going to help us build the right tools and address the right problems.
Yeah, that's a great point. We see that a lot in MITRE, where there are things that MITRE can't support. There are things contractors can't support because it's inherently governmental. The government has to own it and see it through.
I really like, just to touch back, how you looked at both sides of the skills gap coin. And I wanted to just recall that a little bit, because that's something that I'm concerned about. And I don't see a lot of talk around that. Everybody is talking about AI skills gap, AI skills gap. We need people who know AI, who can use these tools. And I am more concerned with what you said, is as we replace the younger, less skilled workforce with tools, because the experts can do more, then what is the succession plan for knowledge, right? We need to begin, and this is going a little bit on a tangent, but we need to begin to consider that we're going to have to invest more money in upskilling people who are coming post college, post on the job training, to get them to a level of expertise where, like Wilson, you were saying, who's going to be the one to approve the contract? They need to know what they're looking for. They need to know what great looks like. They need to have some of that experiential learning. And if we're not tackling that, what happens? Then we become more reliant on AI. Now we get this situation where by law, AI can't make the decision, but the people making the decision haven't been there with as much experience as their predecessors.
I would just quickly and simply say that through my conversations, at least, people are describing these tools more as a kind of staff augmentation tool rather than taking over entire, lines of effort. And so, with that, I completely agree that you still have to have that contingency planning conversation of like, okay, if we are saying that this tool now can take over, this responsibility, we still need to make sure that if that tool goes down, someone can still perform that role. But by and large, I see in acquisition AI being more an augmentation tool rather than taking over entire acquisition functions.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think, to echo what Wilson just said, AI has sort of been a digital advisor or a digital mentor to a lot of people. Now, there may still be a gap between the AI's level of understanding and the subject matter experts, where there would be situational context. So I think there's a combination there where, on the job training, working with the experts for some of the younger generation, as well as leveraging the AI to learn more of the breadth of things that you'll do on a day-to-day. Right. So I think there's a combination there, but I think inherently the risk is, similar to what you were saying, look at the baby boomer generation. It was one of the largest generations in the history of the world. Right. And we've got a lot of baby boomers coming up on retirement, and we might struggle with the sheer workforce numbers to replace the productivity of the baby boomers. Now, that's where some of the automation and AI could potentially come in and help enhance. But again, it cannot take the place of the human agency. And I think that's where you really have to find that balance of, okay, how much of this can be technology driven, automated AI, and how much of this does need to have human in the loop integration, human agency overseeing. And there will likely be more positions available than there are bodies to fill in the future at some point, if you believe in the population decline that is potentially coming. So,
Wilson, any last points on human in the loop? And then I would like to talk a little more on the technical side.
No. I think we covered it pretty well.
Okay, I agree. Great. So let's pivot a little bit to prerequisites on the technical side. As agencies are thinking about bringing on some of these tools, what do they need to start thinking about to prepare themselves technically to bring on tools and gain value from them?
From my perspective, I think there's a couple of things agencies need to think about. I've been on this kick lately, so I'm going to keep rolling with it here. I think independent assessments are a key valuable assessment tool within any organization. Essentially, what an independent assessment can do is help you identify what your core root of problems are without the bias of me saying, well, I've worked in this space for 20 years and I know that this is the problem, right? Let's remove all of the assumptions and let's look at what the core problem is. And I think from a process perspective, you need to really look at the details of your acquisition process within your organization, right? Look at what your resources are. Look at how much workflow there is. Look at all of the demand, right? See where do you have gaps? And then from there, what does the data look like driving those processes, right? Do you have the ability to look at past contracts? Is it a 10-year window? Is it a 50-year window? Like what does your data look like? And if you have a good understanding of where your risks are with data and your gaps are with data, if you have an understanding of where your process is, then you can start to find pieces that you can integrate AI and automation into to help streamline some of those activities. But if you don't have a good holistic understanding of where you're starting, it's really hard to just throw stuff at the process and then expect great outcomes on the back end.
Yeah, jumping off of that. So on the technical side of things, I've heard that DoD is both swimming in data as well as doesn't know what to do with that data, and that they're also not good at collecting data. And so there are these like two sides of a coin, and so there's a lot of effort inside the department at trying to clean the data, store it, make use of it, build these tools. And there is progress, but I think a lot of people are still frustrated. And so, like Chris said, if you're looking at contracting data, they might not have it 15 years, prior, or but they might have it 10 years prior. So, like, it can be such a hit or miss thing. And as far as I understand it, they're starting to make some changes in terms of data collection, but that's a significant barrier when you talk about inside the government building tools. I would also just say that I had mentioned Nipper GPT. One of the things that I read online publicly about that tool is that DoD needs to prioritize more computing power to support the processing of algorithms and data. Some of the feedback regarding Nipper GPT was that there's some shortfalls in compute. And so thinking about that, I just want to also briefly touch on ATOs. That's a huge barrier. And when we think about the technical side of it, getting companies into this ecosystem and allowing them to share their software is a huge pain. We heard it at the event. The ATOs are really confusing, and it's a convoluted process. And so I know that there's been a lot of discussion on ATOs, but that was just something that everyone reiterated.
An ATO is
authority to operate.
Yeah, authority to operate. Yeah, and there are a couple variations that have come out, like continuous authority to operate, CATO. And so, there's some movement, but people are still very much complaining about them.
From the vendor side, when you think about like the FedRAMP process, right? It's all about code compliance. That is a very lengthy process that vendors have to go through before they can even think about hosting their platform, or before the federal government can host that platform. So, there's a lot of restriction around these processes, to Wilson's point, and it's very difficult for vendors to get into these spaces. So when you look at a lot of these AI companies, they're startups, right? Palantir does a bunch of work with AI and they're very good at it. But a lot of these use case spaces are startup companies that are trying to solve a very specific problem, but they don't have history with the government. So in order for them to go through these processes, it can cost them millions of dollars and months of time in order to achieve compliance, so that they can show the federal government their systems and they can start playing with it, or sandbox, or pilot program it. So there is a barrier to adoption from industry to government. And I don't know what the solution is, but I do know that there needs to be a more transparent way to interact with these smaller industry players. And if it's valuable to the government, find ways to incentivize them to keep going, or even maybe help them through this process if there's a way they can do that.
Because there's a big push to also work with smaller innovative businesses within the US, right? And I've done a lot of research and talking with people around CIBRs and government grants and just the overall ecosystem of saying, hey, there are large players, but we also want to incentivize smaller business and help support them. So, I definitely see we need ways to accelerate and help them get their foot in the door that isn't just, we're going to raise funding and hope that in the next year we're still around to close a contract.
I will say that the CDAO TradeWinds platform has been pretty impressive, where they've been able to upload certain capabilities onto their TradeWinds site. I believe it's free to use for anybody with a .mil address, but don't quote me on that because I'm not positive, but I believe that's what I heard. But that's just a small sample or a small example of a singular agency within the DoD that's, put in the effort to pull these companies in and try to give them access to other organizations within their agency.
So let's talk about recommendations and next steps. We've peppered them in a little bit throughout the conversation, but I would love to leave our audience with some actionable, here are the things you need to think about. Here's what's coming down the pipeline. We talked a little bit about policy, any frameworks for adoption that might be in the works. How do organizations align themselves to move quickly or as quick as they can?
So I'll start a little bit broad and then I'll wiggle my way down. I think the major thing that we heard is for both industry and government is to understand your workflow. And so, pick, a painful part of your process, where hours are spent on this really, mundane and repetitive task, map it and understand in your workflow why that particular step exists and challenge it. I think a lot of people just assume that these steps are here to stay forever. And so think about, okay, maybe we might be able to change this, tweak a little bit and redesign the workflow to fit that AI tool. And again, keep in mind that you're trying to use it as a staff augmentation tool, not completely erase a particular line of effort. Specifically, I can just speak on in the defense context. We're fully for more pilot programs. This gets back to how do you incentivize people to use these tools, and I think the best way is for the Hill to push the department to use more commercially available AI tools. In that, there needs to be strict criteria for evaluating success. And then a thing that the department doesn't do very well, which is, okay, we did these pilot programs, now what? Okay, you need to fund and plan for success. And so if these tools work, they're helpful, people like them, have a plan to scale them and have the money to do so. And then in that, also information share. There's also another complaint, which is that, as far as I understand, there's no kind of PEO for acquisition tools. And so it would be great to have, a program of record for acquisition tools so that there's a continuous line of funding and effort towards, these back office functions. And so those are two things that I would recommend as specific actions that we should take that would actually do a lot of good.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said, Wilson. And I also think we need to have an eye on the early implementation part of the process. So when you are implementing a tool, it's generally to solve a problem within your process. I've seen firsthand organizations that have wanted to bring in tools or systems to solve problems, and then the system goes down, the problem still persists. What did we do wrong? I think, very similar to the data revolution, you have to have oversight, right? You have to have your leadership really advocating for these changes. On top of that, you have to understand how to streamline the process manually or in a way that it's not dependent on these tools first. Once you do that, once you have a better streamlined process or where you're solving as many problems as you can up front, that's where you add enhancements. So from my perspective, these tools should be enhancements to systems, not problem solving inherently, right? The enhancement may speed you up, and you could look at that time lapse as a problem that you're now accounting for. However, if that process is not efficient to start with, throwing a tool at it is very likely to not be as successful as you're hoping it to be. So you really have to take an eye to the entire process. And sort of going back to my process design background, you really have to look at the start and end of the entire process. Look at the goals, look at the policies that are driving that process. What do you have to be compliant with? And make sure that you're constantly auditing those policies so that if there are changes, you're not doing something within that process that's no longer necessary, right? So I think having that full holistic lifecycle approach to these types of implementations are really what's going to set you up for success in the long run. And that's a hard thing to do. Otherwise, everybody would be doing it. But I think it's an important mind frame to have.
Some of the things that I'm hearing from that I really believe, and I'll go backwards from what you were saying. So, the first one, the tool is not the silver bullet. It's not going to solve foundational, fundamental, structural issues. And this is another thing that I see in enterprises in private industry is, hey, we want to come in with this tool and that's going to solve the problem. And then you go in and say, great, where's your data? They say, oh, there's a locker right there that hasn't been updated in 20 years. So the tool is not a silver bullet. The next thing you mentioned, and I really like this, what did we do wrong? And this mentality in itself, I think just shows how we approach pilots and these experiments as it's going to fail or it's going to succeed. When the reality is, what you're trying to get to is, what did we learn? How do we iterate? What can we take back to change it? As soon as you start thinking in terms of what did we do wrong, then people are going to say, I don't want to mess up. So we're going to be really cautious because if we make a mistake, this is going to look negative. It goes to that fail fast Silicon Valley mentality. And I hate that term because you're not failing. You're learning. We need to change this. And then the last thing, Wilson, you mentioned this, the planning for success. And it ties into the mentality of what did we do wrong? You're looking at the pilot and that experiment as this is going to tell us whether or not we can proceed forward. When you could be saying, what if this is successful? What's our next step going to be? We need to assume, and this is a bit of my optimism hat, which doesn't always come on, but I like when it does come on. You have to think about, well, what if this works? What are we going to do to handle it? Because I think it's even worse than what if this goes wrong is what if this exceeds the expectations and we're not ready to move forward? What did we do?
I know this just came to me. It's you plan for failure, but prepare for success.
That's great.
That's amazing.
I don't know. Silver bullet just hit me in the head, I guess.
Perfect. So let's come up with some concluding points, with the work that you guys are doing between ETI and MITRE and helping shape the approach. How do organizations continue to work with you, individuals? How can we collaborate and foster this innovative ecosystem?
I would also put on my optimistic hat and say that, based on my conversation or our conversations with folks at our event, there's a lot of enthusiasm out there. And so I think just keep putting your foot on the pedal and keep working on it, because I think, the more we kind of get the message out there, and that's partly why we did the paper, which is just to get the message out there that, hey, there are these tools that are out there and they work. People are excited about them, and let's, connect government, academia, and industry together to try to help solve some of these problems. I know NDIA, ETI, and MITRE, we're both thinking about these issues quite hard. We're interested in doing more work. And so if there's anybody that, is interested in collaboration, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'm sure, Chris as well. because this is something that we're both passionate about and we want to keep working on.
Yeah, absolutely. So within MITRE and the Innovative Acquisition Center that I sit on, we have a team called Acquire, spelled ACQAIRE, and it stands for Acquisition AI Research. We have a small team around this. That's the team that partnered with Wilson, NDIA, ETI. And we've actually built some micro tools, as we call them, to help with some of these processes as we are piloting these tools. They are not solutions for sale. They're simply experimentation that we are doing internal to MITRE. But I will say that we are always looking for partners. We've engaged with several organizations from industry. We like collaborating, sharing feedback on the tools, seeing how the tools can be useful, especially as MITRE is working as an advocate with sponsors with the government space. So yeah, definitely reach out to myself, cbarlow@mitre.org. Happy to collaborate and engage on a number of these different topics as we're moving into the future.
Great. Well, I wanted to thank you both for this. It is jam-packed of information. Where can we referenced this paper a number of times. So where can we find it? I'm going to put links, of course, to both of your contact information, ETI, MITRE, and this paper in the show notes. Where else could we find it?
Yeah, so one of Chris's colleagues is going to be presenting the paper at Naval Postgraduate School's annual Acquisition Research Symposium next week, and that's May 7th. That document will live on NPS's website. However, there's also going to be a separate publication location on the Emerging Technologies Institute's website, so you can find it there. If you want to reach out to me as well, my email is wmiles@ndia.org. I would also just say that we're thinking about maybe having, another event, another paper. We're always thinking about what to do next. So again, if there's any interest in there to help inform and shape the second iteration of this, let us know.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Really appreciate your time and this deep dive.
Thank you for having us on.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Facing Disruption's Future of series. If you're eager to stay ahead of tomorrow's trends and be ready for what's next, I invite you to subscribe and join our community of forward-thinking innovators. And if you're interested in bringing more of these insights directly to your team, reach out. My team and I are here to help you face what's next and turn disruption into opportunity.